Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for accepting my abstract and allowing me to present. This is a wonderful August gathering, and I'm going to load you with a lot of molecular information here. So please be ready for it, but I'll end it on a sweet note, which you'll be very familiar with. So please bear with me for all the technical jargon that I'm about to use here. It'll be very simple. It'll really not be too technical for you. So the title of my talk is DNA and Consciousness. How many of you have heard of the word DNA? Okay, I'm looking for those who've never heard of it, because that's going to be a problem. Right, so before I present my talk, there are certain disclaimers I'd like to make, because I am formally not trained in the areas of psychology and consciousness. I'm a hardcore molecular biologist. And I do not conduct any research on consciousness. In fact, all the researchers here were absolutely brilliant. I'd love to learn a little bit more from them. And secondly, this presentation is very informational in nature, and the facts are already known, so what's so new about it? What I've done is I've analyzed these facts with a magnifying glass, and I've teased out some of the findings I've discovered, and that's what I'm going to present to you. So, the outline of my talk is fairly simple. I will give you a brief introduction about DNA, exactly what DNA is, talking about properties, and then touching a little bit on the central dogma of molecular biology. And finally, I'll get to the crux of my talk, which is DNA conscious? Does it have free will? And so forth. And finally, is our genetic code predetermined? Is it destined? Are we destined for certain things to be done, or can we change our destiny? And finally, we'll talk on the Vedic concept of consciousness, which is very interesting. So the DNA, as we all know, is regarded as the blueprint of life. And DNA is present in each one of our 23 pairs of chromosomes. So on the left slide shows you a fantastic graphic that every student is expected to know today. That is the double helical structure of DNA, which is basically what we are made up of. And the second panel shows you a karyotype, which is basically a blood cell which is taken, and the cell is lysed, which is broken, and the chromosomes are smeared on a glass slide. And typically this is what the doctors do if they want to find out that a baby is destined to have a genetic disease and so forth. So all these chromosomes are actually loaded with DNA. So DNA is a very, very important molecule in the body. So the word DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the one of the two kinds of nucleic acids. The first is DNA and the second is RNA. And of course, it's the blueprint of life. The DNA was first identified in 1860s by the Swiss chemist Miescher, and then later Chargaff and Levin revealed the structure through its primary chemical components in the 1940s. Of course, the Nobel Prize was eventually given to Watson and Crick, who actually solved the DNA structure in 1953. But the information that they received from the study of Franklin and Wilkins was absolutely instrumental for them to devise the double helical structure of DNA. So DNA is astounding. I'm going to leave you with these numerical facts which are absolutely astounding. I've been studying DNA for 25 years, and when I see these numbers, it's absolutely amazing how wonderful nature can be. Just to give you a little bit of facts here. The human genome is composed of 3.2 billion base pairs, and we have 2 copies of each of the chromosomes. So we are carrying 6.4 billion base pairs of DNA within us. Every human cell has DNA, except the mature red blood cell, and certain quantified cells of the nails and the hair and so forth. Pretty much every cell has DNA. Humans share 95% of DNA with primates, monkeys, and gorillas, and astoundingly, 50% with bananas. And what's interesting to me as a molecular biologist is 99.9% of all of us in this room are identical. It's the 0.1% difference which makes us all extremely unique, which is very challenging to grasp. And the DNA is huge, but only 1 to 3% of the total DNA codes for proteins. So what's the remaining 97% doing? It's not junk. It used to be called junk, but now it is known as regulatory DNA. And if unraveled, this is the big part, if a single cell is broken open and the entire DNA is unraveled. Each DNA would measure 6 feet long. And each one of us has 100 trillion cells. So you do the math. Take out the DNA from each one of those 100 trillion cells, and guess how long would that be? That would be several trips to the sun and back. And that's the amount of DNA that we are carrying in our body. It is compacted about 200,000-fold. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have much more respect for your DNA, considering how great it is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the properties and not get too much into the science. These properties are very important to understand why DNA can be regarded as a conscious molecule. So the chemical, mechanical, biological, informational, and electrical properties. So chemically, it is a double helical structure composed of 3 separate components: a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. The helix is anti-parallel in nature. That's a double helical structure, which pretty much every student knows now. The backbone is composed of sugar and phosphates, and there are 4 bases which are lined internally, and these are stacked on top of each other like a staircase. So this DNA has polarity. One strand runs from 5' to 3', while the other strand runs in the opposite direction. And one important feature about DNA, without which none of us would survive, is it can melt. That means the 2 strands can come apart, and they can go back, come apart, go back. And that is very critical for the DNA to duplicate itself. Of course, the DNA itself can be influenced by pH and solvents and temperatures in the environment. And of course, it can also be cross-linked and modified, which is very important in today's health industry for delivering drugs and so forth. So in terms of forms of DNA, we have 3 major forms of DNA, the A, B, and Z. And physiologically, in each one of our cells, it is the B form which is most predominant. The A and Z forms can occur depending on conditions of pH and salt in the cell. Mechanically, DNA is a very flexible molecule. It has high curvature, it can be bent without breaking, and it can be tightly wound too. And these dynamics are very, very important because DNA is consistently interacting with proteins. And so for a protein to interact with DNA, it's very important that the DNA is very flexible in nature. Likewise, DNA can also interact with electromagnetic radiation. DNA can absorb light. Depending on whether DNA is double-stranded or single-stranded, it will have different capacities to absorb light. And this is very important to us in our experimentation when we are dealing with isolation of DNA and looking at its quality. Electrically, this is a very new field which I'm really not an expert in. This is known as nanobiotechnology, where DNA is found to have insulating properties, and it can be placed between 2 electrodes where it will function as a molecule which is capable of transmitting information. And finally, that's where I come in. This is what I study. What are the informational properties of DNA? And does anyone know what this table is? Although I've written it there, this is the code of life. This is the genetic code, which is basically a combination of different nucleotides in a triplet form, which will be converted into amino acids, which will be converted into proteins, and basically how proteins function within us is going to determine how healthy we are going to be. And biologically, DNA is a very, very active molecule. It duplicates itself, it can transcribe into an RNA molecule, and the RNA can be converted into a protein molecule. And this is where I mentioned that I've been trained in a hardcore molecular sciences. This can be very technical, but all these parameters of DNA are very important in determining how DNA is functioning as the blueprint of our life. So, let's talk a little bit about the central dogma of molecular biology. Even in molecular biology, there is a basic tenet on which everything is based. So essentially, we have 3 molecules, the DNA, the RNA, and the protein. And theoretically, this is only on paper, DNA can be converted to RNA, RNA can be converted to protein, and theoretically, protein should be able to be converted to DNA, but this never happens. What essentially happens is the central dogma. DNA is transcribed into RNA, which is the intermediate molecule between DNA and protein, and RNA is converted into protein itself. So this was a central dogma which persisted for several years, because initially it was thought that there is only one arrow, DNA going to RNA and RNA going into protein. And this dogma existed for several years. Later, this dogma was violated extensively through the discovery of various new enzymes, namely the discovery of reverse transcriptase, which is basically an enzyme which is found in viruses such as retroviruses, which cause HIV, the HIV which causes AIDS. And essentially, what retroviruses showed was RNA can in fact be converted back to DNA. So a new arrow was placed in the central dogma, which shows that RNA can revert back to DNA. And this, of course, opened up the whole new theory of whether DNA is the origin of life, or is it really RNA the origin of life? And that debate is consistently ongoing. So second discovery was the observation of long non-coding RNA molecules, and this is a whole area in itself essentially. Thirdly, there was a discovery of prions, which suggested that the genetic information is not passed on by DNA, but genetic information can also be passed on by proteins, which was a huge discovery. So I'm going to skip these. These are just graphics which show you how the central dogma was violated by various discoveries. So is DNA conscious? So the whole important point is, how do we define consciousness? So for consciousness, it is important that it be autopoietic, that means self-maintaining, dynamic, and evolving. And all these three parameters, as based on the properties I showed you, are actually shown by DNA. And consciousness is constructed of its own constituents, such as emotions, perceptions, and so forth. So where does DNA come in? So according to Freud, there are three levels of awareness or consciousness, which I have teased out and sort of corroborated with the way I study DNA. There's a pre-conscious stage, which I consider to be a double-stranded DNA, the conscious state to be the single-stranded DNA, and the unconscious state to be known as the triple helix, which is a very unique form of DNA. Likewise, according to the Mandukya Upanishad in the Vedic conception, there are four phases: the waking phase, the dreaming phase, the deep sleep, and the pure absolute phase. So for all the first three phases, I have a molecule which I can say is corresponding to these three phases, but I don't have a molecule which corresponds to the highest phase, which is the phase of pure absolute. So does DNA have its free will? I'm going to ask you a question now. If you had a choice of becoming old in life or getting cancer, what would you choose? Okay, that's exactly what DNA is doing. DNA has free will. Given a choice, DNA makes proteins which will allow it to become old rather than causing it to carcinogenesis or cause cancer. Likewise, DNA codes for enzymes which will degrade itself. DNA has also capacity of coding enzymes which can fix its errors. And finally, DNA can also encode an enzyme which was just touched upon by Venugopal, which says that DNA has a problem of it's known as the end replication problem, but DNA makes enzymes which will actually prevent that problem from occurring, but unfortunately the enzyme that causes it loses its activity over a period of time. So DNA has a capacity to eradicate itself, so it does have free will. DNA has a capacity through proteins to chew itself up, so it does have free will. DNA can also correct its own aberrations, so it does have free will. And finally, DNA can also impact how the cells divide, how the cells age, and so forth. So it does have a lot of free will. And of course, DNA is a very malleable molecule, which is very important for it to have a free will. So is DNA conscious? The important point is our consciousness can be changed. So if consciousness is dictated by the DNA code, can the code be influenced to impact our consciousness? That is a big question. So output of the code, although the code itself cannot be changed, but the output can be changed. So when I say output, that means mutations in the DNA, either through exposure through cigarette smoke or ultraviolet radiation and so forth, or what we call epigenetics, which means modifying the DNA without really modifying its sequence, which can actually change our behavior, which I'm going to show you right towards the end if time permits. And this field, which causes change in the DNA, how the DNA is decorated without changing the actual sequence is known as epigenetics. And this has gained tremendous impetus in today's molecular world because it reflects how our environment can really impact how we think, how we perceive, how we respond, and so forth. So I'm going to skip these two slides essentially. And towards the end, I'd just like to mention that our DNA is extremely complex. We share our DNA with lots of organisms, and we are extremely complex in our consciousness. But there are other organisms who have much more number of genes than us, but essentially they are not at the same level of consciousness like us. And then we have a whole series of another organisms, if we can call them organisms, known as viruses to contend with. Now towards the end, I'm going to give you a little bit of a Vedic concept of consciousness, where consciousness can be influenced by internal factors such as karmic reactions, or external factors, which could be very large in number. So internal factors are the previous conceptions of life, which are basically the material modes of nature. So the question is there any evidence of genes here? Are genes going to influence our how our consciousness is dictated? The answer is, I don't know. That's something that has to be done more. Secondly, the external factors which influence consciousness, this is what we call the 4 S's. Sadhana, which is prayer, Sadachar, which is our behavior, Sangha, which is our association, and finally Seva, which is a service. These are external factors which are influencing our consciousness. So according to the Vedic concept of consciousness, the soul, the consciousness is actually the symptom of the soul. And how big is the soul? Srila Prabhupada writes the soul is 1/10,000th part of the tip of the human hair. And I did some calculations here to find out that the average size of the hair tip is about 20 microns. And theoretically, the size of the soul is 2 nanometers. So if you do the math, the DNA helix comes out to be exactly the size of the soul, which is 2 nanometers. So I'm going to end with these last 4 or 5 slides. I'll try to make it quick. I've tried to compare the molecular concept with the Vedic concept, and this is where I found some very interesting sort of similarities here. According to the molecular concept, the primary progenitor is DNA. According to the Vedic concept, the primary progenitor is God, whom we call Krishna, the most attractive. According to molecular concept, the secondary progenitors are the 4 bases of DNA, A, T, G, and C. And according to Vedas, the secondary progenitors are the Chaturvyuha, Shankarshan, Anirudh, Pradyumna, and Vasudeva. Likewise, the central dogma of molecular biology relies on the trinity of DNA, RNA, and protein. According to the Vedas, the trinity are Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh. Likewise, the prominent form of the nucleic acid which is involved in the maintenance of everything in the cell is the RNA molecule. The RNA is found in 3 primary forms, M, T, and R. If you look who is responsible for maintenance of the universe, that's Vishnu, who's present in 3 forms, Karano-dakshay Vishnu, Shiro-dakshay Vishnu, and Gargo-dakshay Vishnu. Finally, the energetic code is a triplet code, that's the genetic code. And likewise, when we talk about Krishna, his energies are 3, internal, external, and marginal. This is where the anomaly is. Right now, there are 22 different amino acids which make up the protein. And proteins are basically what drives the cells to live. According to the Sankhya philosophy, the material cosmos is made up of 24 elements. So if anyone is interested, there is a need to find out those 2 remaining amino acids. Finally, the genetic code is made up of 64 different codons. That means these 64 are basically going to determine what your amino acids are. And guess what? Krishna has 64 transcendental qualities. So I'm going to end here and leave it for you to judge for yourself. DNA is the blueprint of life. DNA is conscious. Does it have free will? That can be controversial. And finally, is it conscious? Can the DNA be changed as a result of diet, meditation, and prayer? Yes, there is extensive evidence that our external influence, which is prayer and meditation and mantra chanting, can actually impact the DNA and change its profile drastically for the good. So I will end here by showing you a cake here, how I really think of DNA as. DNA is basically the flour and the oil and the baking powder and the sugar which makes up the cake. And depending on how we decorate the cake, we can actually go towards better health or detrimental health. For instance, the fruits on the cake can be regarded as the prayers. The walnuts can be the impact of the meditation. The icing, which is just butter and sugar, very detrimental for diabetic patients, can be regarded as very unhealthy. And the candles, depending on how many we have on the cake, can be very detrimental for our internal health. With this, I'll end my talk, and please forgive me for going a little bit over time. Thank you.